So welcome to this fifth webinar of the Zero Emission Buildings Academy, a partnership between Building Performance Institute Europe, BPIE, ECTP, the European Construction Technology Platform, and the European Copper Institute. I'm Quentin de Hulst, Director of Green Healthy Buildings at the European Copper Institute, and today I'm glad to welcome Sibylle Stoiver from BPIE in Berlin, so head of the Berlin office, but also researcher on topics of minimum energy performance standards, which is our topic of today. A very timely topic because, as you may know, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is being revised and it's now in trilogue, so a negotiation between the Parliament, the Council and the Commission. And next week there is a key meeting where some decisions are expected on minimum energy performance standards. We will not discuss the details of what is on the table today, but we want to discuss how to design this approach in an effective way. Everyone knows that building renovation is necessary with many good benefits. The challenge is how to do it properly, how to make sure that the building stock is renovated. And for this, minimum performance standards are a key instrument. Myself, I have the pleasure to live in a highly efficient house, and several years ago I had a not well-performing house, and then I started renovation, and it's clear that this direction is needed for everyone, and I think all the worst-performing buildings should be renovated to get to better performance that's needed for the comfort of everyone and to address energy and climate change challenges that we have. So I will now give the floor to our guest, Sibylle Stoiver, to present the approach proposed by BPIE, having analyzed many elements to design a successful minimum energy performance standards framework. So Sibylle, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and I think it's great to discuss this important topic today. I will share my screen in a minute, and I hope you can see that now.
Yes, it's working perfectly.
So great. I'm going to talk about minimum energy performance standards. So as you mentioned before, it's a topic that is, while not entirely new in Europe, it recently gained a lot of attention in the negotiations of the EPBD recast. And as you said, I will focus on important design principles and introduce you to our proposal for a main architecture of such an instrument that applies these design principles. Let me start with a definition, since this definition is currently the basis for the negotiation at EU level. I took the definition of Meps from the EPBD recast proposal of the Commission. So, and that states that minimum energy performance standards means rules that require existing buildings to meet an energy performance requirement as part of a wide renovation plan for building stock. So it's either the building stock or segments of the building stock, or at a trigger point on the market. Typically it's after sale or rent, that minimum energy performance level, for example, expressed in kilowatt hours per square meter in year, or attached to a EPC label class, will have to be reached, or in a period of time, or, and this is what is currently in particular in the focus, is to enacted by a specific date and thereby triggering renovation of existing buildings. So this one would then be very much in line to what most of you will know, this Commission proposal to have specific dates as trigger points. The Commission proposed to require, for example, all non-residential buildings to have at least the EPC class F by 2027 and EPC class E by 2030 and so on. So, so you can see already by the definition there that the understanding of what a minimum energy performance standard is rather wide. And we say it's important to make sure that we have a design for minimum energy performance standards that are fair and effective. And fair because it's important to make the benefits of renovation as well as the support and financing available to all, and in particular to those who have less income, to vulnerable groups, and it's important to leave no one behind. And secondly, it's important to have effective designs, which means that they should, in a fast way, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And how does that translate into the design principles? So the first principle would be to address the worst performing buildings first, so that people see an immediate and meaningful impact. And addressing the worst performing buildings first has an advantage, or has several advantages actually. First, this is the segment where we see the high energy saving potential, and to reach a good level of energy performance in a cost-effective way. And through the overlap of worst performing buildings and lower income households and people sometimes suffering from energy poverty, we are automatically reaching out to vulnerable groups, and by renovating their homes, improving their living conditions immediately. So that's an important principle. And I have one slide here that shows you the worst performing floor area in the EU 27. And you see it illustrates how much energy is actually consumed in those worst performing square meters. And you see that in many countries, it's well above 200 kilowatt hours per square meters a year. It's the 15 worst performing floor area. And keeping in mind the goal to reach the climate neutral building stock in 2050, which is also highly efficient, and knowing that many of the existing buildings will then still be there. So renovating those worst performing buildings is really absolutely necessary and means that we are picking the low-hanging fruits. The second design principle is that it has to make sure that it's aligned with the owner's abilities to invest. So people are to a different extent able or have different opportunities to invest. That is certainly depending on income of people, which means that we need to design schemes that allow also low income groups to have that investments. Then we have the group of tenants, which have often little to say and have no influence on the renovation decision. And of course, the size of the stock that certain landlord owns varies a lot. And we know from first evaluations in member states where such schemes already exist that it's easier for those who professionally manage and own a larger building portfolio to comply without a lot of support. So there's different needs for different groups, certainly. While this is super true, still we argue that, and some people argue actually that the non-residential sector is easier to reach. And while this holds true for certain groups, this graph also shows that there is a strong necessity to really also tackle the residential sector. So if you look, and if you make a cut at a consumption level of 200 kilowatt hours per square meter a year, you see that the floor area in the residential sector is twice as high as the ones in the service sector. So this is just this for a couple of countries. But we see that that there is a large difference, or that the residential sector really is an important sector to tackle from a climate viewpoint, but also, as I said earlier, to help tenants and low-income households to improve their living conditions. And taking these insights from the existing schemes and first evaluations, we propose actually two different design schemes for Meps. First of all, it's important to cover all buildings, but it makes sense to group them a little bit. So we propose to group those who large buildings, non-residential buildings and public buildings, as well as owners of multifamily buildings, like single owners in one group, and smaller landlords, and those of non-residential buildings, of smaller non-residential buildings and single family buildings in a Meps system B, like a separate design, basically. The third design principle for effective and fair Mep schemes would be to make the requirements binding and foreseeable to accelerate innovation in the energy renovation supply chain. And we know that standards, especially in the field of energy and resource efficiency, were triggering innovation in the past under the precondition that they're binding and foreseeable. And we carried out a range of expert interviews in different project contexts, and we learned that many actors from the construction industry are actually asking for Meps to create demand for innovation, also as an important means to address the recession in the construction industry. The fourth design principle would be to have an effective compliance, support, and enforcement system. From the UK evaluations, we know that compliance was driven by the expectations of fines for non-compliance. But we also know from evaluations in the Netherlands that a stepwise enforcement with support on how to do the renovations and where to get the money from, and including actually also a proper scheme of financial support, is considered appropriate and useful. So it's not that from one day to the other you will be fine, but to have a cascade of enforcement in place is helpful. And last but not least, it's important to define regular and frequent milestones in order to avoid technical and carbon lock-ins. So it's important to know what the future standard for the building stock is and how that individual buildings are supposed to contribute to it. And especially if stepwise renovations are the preferred option to renovate by the building owner, then it's important to have frequent milestones, and a building renovation passport is, we consider that super important and helpful to guide investment decisions. And I'll come to the importance of building renovation passports in this context. I come to that in a bit. So as I've shown you that scheme before, this is basically to introduce you now to the two Meps design architects that we propose. We have this Meps system A for the larger owners of larger portfolios, and for especially multifamily buildings with single owners. And it's rather straightforward. It shows it's binding, it's foreseeable, and has frequent milestones. And the idea is to divide the whole building stock into tranches according to percentiles. And then you start with a requirement to bring the 15% worst performing floor area. We said that it makes sense to have the unit floor area, because that's what's important in order to get the emissions down as well. To get those 15 worst performing percent to a performance level that is at least better than the median. So by that, you would then change the performance level that matches the 50th percentile. And then at the next year, you or after a couple of years, you would then have the second requirements for the next 15%, and thereby you reduce the target consumption level, and ideally this will not stop. With after 2 times, like with the very worst performing buildings, but really to have something like a dynamic system in place that would then lead to a zero emission building stock that is highly efficient. But this is actually also not part of a current discussion, political discussion. And the other Meps system for those who would need more support, especially for single family buildings, we would suggest to have to make sure that informed investment decisions can be taken. So again, here you have the building stock divided in tranches, sorted by the worst performing buildings, and typically, well, that's probably the easiest way to identify them is through the EPCs. And then you oblige the public authorities, or the idea is to oblige public authorities to provide renovation passports to the worst performing buildings by a certain date. So this is this first, what you see here with RP, say, okay, by 2025, the first 15 worst performing buildings should have a building renovation passport. And then a couple of years later, the next tranche should receive that building renovation passport. And then the owners shall implement measures from the building renovation passports, either stepwise. So for example, 20% savings by 2030, 40% savings by 2035, etc., to then reach a deep renovation level in the end that would be compliant with a zero emission building stock. Or to incentivize one-step renovation at one at a time and support this with extra financial support, basically. And then the later we are in time, the less time is to have several step renovation, and also the better the performance of that building would be. So the percentage would not have to be 60% probably, but a bit different. But this is just a general mechanism that I'm introducing here. And I mentioned that earlier, it's important to overcome challenges in implementation. And there's certainly exemptions to be established at some point at the national level. However, what is important is to provide support. One piece of support is certainly building renovation, like renovation advice, for example, through renovation passports, but financial support schemes is also important. And they should be designed in a way to support Meps compliance ahead of the deadline. So they act as an early indicator of future standards. And we just have here an illustrative example how to incentivize early renovation ahead of enforcement date. So saying before 2026, for example, the grant would cover 15% of the renovation costs if it's only the renovation leading to a level D, and the higher the level that is reached, the higher the support here. And the later you decide to renovate your building, the lower are the rates of financing to incentivize really early and deep renovation. And now I'm coming to my last slide here, which is recommendations for fair and effective Meps schemes. So summarizing a bit what I've said before, Meps should apply to all building typologies with an initial focus on worst performing buildings. It's important to harness these energy savings, and therefore Meps should be applied to both residential and non-residential buildings. The EPBD revision should include these 5 design principles. Certainly, a lot of the implementation and actual design will have to happen at the member states level, but it should also minimize the exemptions to not undermine the effectiveness of the Meps scheme. But still, we know and have a lot of practice examples that Meps can be designed flexibly at member states level. And very important, any Meps scheme put in place must be implemented with a comprehensive ecosystem of support. So financial support, but also targeted support that reaches really the vulnerable groups. And this is where I stop. If you want to read the full report, you're very welcome to do so. And I stop sharing my screen here.